Welcome to Monomythic. Today's topic is making newspaper comics. I'm Kevin Garcia, professional comic book historian, and joining me today are the two creators of two of the hottest comics newspapers, Baldo and Heart of the City. So I'd like to welcome them right now. Steenz, you recently took over for Mark Tatuli's Heart of the City?
I did.
Yeah, and then Hector, you co-created Baldo alongside Carlos Castellanos, Hector Cantu. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you.
So I just want to talk to you guys about newspaper comics, about what is involved in making them, about how you got into the industry and all those kinds of things. Also the fact that you are both very, very active in the cartooning community in different ways as well. So I think that's really, really neat. Steenz, I want to start with you for a quick second. You did not start newspaper comics. You just started literally, what, a week and a half ago? 2 weeks ago?
Yeah. Yeah, about a week and a half ago. I don't know. Time is nothing these days.
Yeah. Prior to that, you got an award, got several awards, I guess, for some of your other work in independent comics, like Archival Quality, which you made with your co-creator, Ivy Noel Weir. Can you tell us a little bit about Archival Quality and then how you shifted into newspaper comics?
Yeah. Archival Quality was a story that Ivy and I worked on together. It was originally going to be a webcomic, and it was a story that Ivy had been working on for a while, and then she approached me about making a webcomic, and I was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And then Oni did their open submissions, and we decided might as well submit, because if we don't get it, we'll just put it online. And we got it, and then we were like, oh no, now we have to draw this book. So it's about a young woman who loses her job at the library because she's having some mental health issues, and she ends up getting a job at a medical oddities museum. And while she's there, she gets haunted by this ghost, and she feels that if she can kind of figure out what happened to this ghost, she can kind of help herself as well. So it's about being in your early 20s and not knowing what you really want to do with your life, but also knowing that if you're going through it, you can't really be an asshole to your friends about it. And yeah, I really, really liked it. And we were both librarians when we did it. So it's definitely straight from the heart for sure. From the heart, which is funny because I do Heart of the City now.
And with that segue, you recently became part of Heart of the City.
Yeah. So I just started doing a freelance cartooning and editorial and teaching last year. And a few months later, I did, a mini comic where I adapted Encyclopedia Brown, and I kept wanting to do more adaptations and, taking characters that have already been around and making them for a newer audience. And then after I put that out, I think in January, Sheena Wolf contacted me, and she was like, are you interested in strip comics? And I was like, I love reading them. What do you mean? And she wanted to know if I wanted to take over for Heart of the City. And it was really interesting because I don't really know anything about the strip comic industry other than, reading them as a young person in the newspaper. I mean, those are some of the first comics I ever read. But I thought it would be a really great opportunity because I kind of like to do a little bit of everything. I teach, and I've been a librarian, and I've done a lot of different stuff in the comics industry. So I was like, well, this could be a really great opportunity for me. And it would be a really great way to, I think, get better at the craft. And I think I've already gotten so much better at making comics after only doing I don't know how many weeks I've drawn now, maybe 8 weeks of comics. And I already feel like I'm super, super good at making comics now. But yeah.
Well, I was going to say real quick, the fact that you said that you didn't know much about it until you got in, that's why I wanted to have you as part of this talk, because you literally are, 1 week in, even though you've got a lot of experience cartooning and teaching. Hector, though, you have been doing this as long as Heart of the City's been around. You've been doing Baldo. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? You are, by the way, just real quick, I'm in Austin. Steenz, you're in St. Louis?
Yep.
All right. And Hector, you are in?
I'm in Dallas.
All right. So Hector, tell us about Baldo. How did that start?
Yeah, I grew up in South Texas, and a cousin of mine way back then used to live in Dallas, and he turned me on to Mad Magazine. And for a little South Texas kid, I mean, that turned into like every month rushing to the drugstore to get my latest copy of Mad Magazine. So I've always been interested in writing ever since, and cartooning ever since I was a kid. And I'd see the names like Sergio Aragonés and Antonio Prohias, the Mad Magazine guys. And it was kind of inspiring to me. I'd go like, wow, they sound Latino. And probably, that's probably something that it's possible for me to someday maybe do. So I do like to tell people I successfully got a mad rejection letter when I was 12 years old.
Yes, the goal.
Yeah, I did.
I think those rejection letters are very important.
Just the chutzpah of me sending something to Mad Magazine when I was 12 years old, thinking it would get published, of course. But then I went into journalism. I worked in a high school newspaper. I went to UT Austin. There you go.
Represent.
Studied journalism there, and started working for newspapers. Always with being a fan of comics and cartooning in the background, as I was like a trained journalist working for newspapers and magazines, always keeping that interest. And then one day, back in 20 years ago or so, I had that dream kind of rekindled, where I just said, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to give this shot of submitting a comic strip proposal to the syndicates and just seeing what happens. And that's when I teamed up with Carlos. We drew the characters, we designed them, and we got 2 offers. In fact, Tribune Media and Universal Press offered us contracts back then, and we were just really excited. And we've been doing it for 20 years.
And that's exactly what I want to talk to you about, the fact that it's been so long. I say so long, let me rephrase that. I have also been in journalism for 20 years. I know. I started off as a reporter right at the beginning of college, actually. I was still getting my degree. And I am not going to lie, before I was a reporter and even after I was a reporter, the first and sometimes only thing I would read in the newspaper was the comics. Right. So, and we had Baldo in South Texas early on. We liked reading a lot of those, the Baldo comics as well. What advice would you give to Steenz now that she's just entering the world of newspapers, that, you've seen over the years, where you're like, don't do what I did when I was younger kind of a thing, or maybe, hey, do this earlier than I did kind of a thing?
Boy, everybody's different. I think Steenz seems like she's doing fine. If she has a syndicated comic strip, that's a great feather in her cap, and that deserves congratulations for her hard work getting her to a syndicated comic strip. That's awesome. Comic strips are so time consuming, as Steenz can probably tell you. Just putting out 7 comic strips a week. People often ask me, like, how many comic strips do you do every week? And I go, it's about 7. Averages, more or less, it averages like 7 a week. If I do less than that, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
So that, and like she just said herself, she's been doing it just for several weeks, and she finds herself already changing as an artist. I mean, because you do it every day. Your characters start changing. If you look at the early Baldos from when we did it 20 years ago, you'll see how the style has changed, because I think Carlos has just grown with the development of the characters, how they're drawn. His style has developed. It's changed over 20 years and becomes more refined. And Carlos does a beautiful job with the comic strip every day. From those early sketches that we did back in 1998 or so.
Well, you brought up the evolution, and I just put up a picture right now that has the very first Baldo strip online, and then one of the more recent ones. I think that the characters have really grown a lot. You can see a lot of the development here as they have transitioned. They became more alive, I think, over time. Right. As the writer, I imagine the characters have also grown with you a bit, but how do you feel about the characters now as opposed to when you created them?
We're one of those strips where nobody ever ages. Baldo's 15 forever. Gracie is 8 forever. But at the same time, I do like to see growth in the characters. I mean, I do like to see them growing and maturing and becoming different and learning things. So they may be the same character and they may be 15 years old. Baldo may be 15, but in this weird cartoon universe, he's learned so much in that 1 year that he's been alive. And I think that's been the challenge for me, is to kind of grow the characters, even though their ages remain the same, of making them more mature, making them learn stuff and moving on. There are lots of times where I'll make a note to myself, for instance, where I'll have written gags about a certain topic, and I'll come to a point where I'm going like, okay, he's going to get over this. We're never going to talk about this again because he's grown beyond that part of his life. And we leave a lot of those stories behind as Baldo gets older. I mean, that's been always my goal for a reader, to say, whoa, Baldo's grown a bit in the past 20 years, hopefully.
That's really interesting that you say that, because, with Heart of the City, Heart has aged. She was like 6 or 8 or so when he started, and now she's a preteen. She's in middle school, and that was actually one of the reasons why Sheena was looking to me to do the comic. Was Heart is turning into a different person now, and while you can have jokes about the idiosyncrasies of childhood and, oh, what's this thing do? And that's the joke. Do that for the rest of Heart's life. Now that she's in middle school, we don't really see that kind of humor, So I'm hoping that I can kind of help that happen and still make it so that it's like a slow aging, because over 20 years she's only aged like 6 years. So I definitely have to figure out how I want to make that growth happen. But that is one of the things that I talked about with Sheena when she first asked me, because to do the audition for the piece, they were like, well, we need you to do 2 weeks of strips. Each strip has to have its own self-contained story and punchline, but there has to be an overarching story. And before I even wanted to do that, I was like, thank you for this opportunity, but let me get some time to read like 5 years worth of this comic. And then also I want to be able to like write up a treatment pretty much of like where I see the comic going in the future. So I could have like kind of a guide for where I want to go with these characters. So hopefully we get to see that growth in it, and it feels well paced, because it's different with strip comics versus graphic novels,
It's funny, looking at your earliest comic versus your newest comic, I can see how much the characters have grown.
I know, so much in 6 days.
Right?
But yeah, I mean, I'm like 6 to 8 weeks ahead at the moment, and I'm just from drawing my dailies today and how I was drawing it 6 weeks ago. I'm already like, I feel like I could draw Heart with my eyes closed, So it's really interesting to see that growth so quickly.
You mentioned that you had to kind of audition, I guess, even though they approached you.
Yeah.
What was it like? Because you have a very distinctive, you actually have a multitude of styles. I've seen you draw different ways, but it still has a very distinct artist hand to it. What was it like, the interaction between you and Mark showing your takes on the characters?
So I actually didn't talk to Mark until I was done. Like, I'm pretty sure it was like 2 days before it released, before I actually had a conversation with him. I don't know why that happened, but I don't know. That's just how it ended up. But with the audition pieces, it was pretty much like, do 2 weeks worth. We'll take a look at, how your pacing is. And the first batch of 2 weeks was kind of rough because I was still getting kind of used to the pacing of the joke telling, but also because what I was doing was pulling from what I knew comic strips were when I was reading them. And oftentimes they kind of have the same type of joke or the same cadence, I guess, of joke telling.
There's a rhythm.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was going for. But then after the second half of those batches, I was like, okay, well, let's push it a little bit more. Let's see what I can bring from my humor online and my graphic novel background and my interest in anime and manga. And let's see if I can move that and bring it into the strips and see if I can kind of elevate it to another level. And Sheena, my editor, noticed that. She was like, your first week is like typical comic strip. The second week is like, this is something we need to elaborate on. So I did another test of 2 weeks, and I ended up doing 6 weeks of testing, which was a lot. But I learned a lot in that time, and I was really able to kind of put myself in those comic strips. And I'm hoping that people can kind of already tell that I'm doing some really interesting and new things with these strips. Everything from layouts to the kinds of jokes to, just how people interact with each other. I'm really trying to make it seem like a new version of a comic strip.
Right. Hector, when you first started out, was that a challenge for you trying to get that daily pattern going? I imagine now it's, I don't want to say easier, but I mean, you know the rhythm now. Was it a challenge when you were first designing it with Carlos?
It's always a challenge. I mean, it's been a daily thing for 20 years of writing, and people say, well, how long does it take you? And I usually say I'm always writing. I'm always keeping notes. I send myself text messages on my phone when I think of something, or I'll forget it. 10 minutes later. It's like, oh, I have a great joke. I'm going to remember this. And like 10 minutes later, it's gone. So I'm constantly writing everywhere. Phones really come in handy. So it's a 24-hour a day job. I mean, it's constant work.
It really is. And I kind of do the same thing. If I think of a joke, like if I don't write it down, that joke is gone. It's not happening. I think there was one night where I was like, oh, that's so funny. And I was like, but let me sleep on it. And I woke up the next morning and I was like, what was it? It's nothing now. So, but it's interesting because I am always worried that I'm going to run out of things to say or some kind of joke. So I actually do 3 months worth of jokes or of strips ahead of time. And I send them to my editor, and it's like separated by day and by Sundays and everything. And then when I finally get to actually drawing it, that's when I can kind of tinker with it and see like, oh, you know what, this joke would be funny if I did this. Like, good thinking, past Steenz, but we can do better, So I like to make sure that I'm always like 10 steps ahead.
That actually ties to a question we got from the live stream, which is just, do you have any advice for creators to come up with a regular amount of jokes? One thing that I've heard a lot of people do is kind of what you were saying, keeping notes and just kind of like writing them down and having that notepad of jokes. Is there anything else you guys suggest to be able to keep both the rhythm of the story going, but also the daily gags going?
I think for me, it's really about continuing to participate with entertainment and reading books, watching TV, listening to music, because all of that is going to give you inspiration for funny things to happen, So when I'm thinking about it, I'll have like a general storyline. So we'll go with the storyline that's happening right now. Heart's trying to get into the school play. And so I'll think about it like, okay, the whole story is she wants to get into the play. So how can we break it down into 5 or 6 days? And then I think about, well, what are the different parts of getting into the play? Okay, now how do I make that funny? And then after that, then I think about, well, how do I tie this into the Sunday? Because Sunday strips are a completely other part of it. So I try and do a kind of formulaic version, try and think of it in a scientific manner instead of, feeling it out.
That question, by the way, is from David James. Thank you, David. Hector, same question. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, you're always watching TV, listening to the radio, reading magazines, reading newspapers, and I'm constantly kind of making fun of stuff as I read it. Going, oh, this is good. And so I'll jot stuff like that down. But the other part of that, I think, for me, is just the character development. What fits with what the characters would do. So if I'm reading something about an illness or somebody being sick or remedies or the new herbal cures, and I think it's silly or stupid, I go, oh, well, that's a Tia Carmen joke. I'll move that over to Tia Carmen. If it's about cars or high schools or teenagers being stupid or crazy, I move that over to the Baldo idea basket. And then with Gracie, I do the same thing. So it's kind of a combination of both, just reading constantly and then trying to find out what observations fit with which characters.
Yeah, I think I do the same exact thing. That's one of the reasons why I was excited about bringing in a new character into Heart, because there was the main three, which is Heart, Dean, and Cat. But I wanted to bring in a new character, Charlotte, not just because of the diversity thing, because Heart needs to have more friends of color. That's all there is to it. But because it would also give me more fodder for the comic. The more characters, the more stories you can come up with.
Right.
Well, actually, let me ask you both about that for a second. Steenz, some of the articles I've seen about you recently have pointed out the fact that you're one of the few, if not only that I can think of, African-American women in newspaper comics right now. And Hector, you've been a big part of a lot of the Latino comics expos. That's how I met you previously. Is there a need for more diversity in newspaper comics? How can that be addressed? I'm talking about both behind the page and in front and on the page, I guess.
Yeah.
Hector?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's enough, and it's great to see, new talent coming up. There's always room for improvement. There's always room for different voices on the comics page, and I'm very lucky to have been doing this for 20 years. But sadly, in those 20 years, the new voices have been kind of rare. You don't see too many of them, just sporadically here and there. So it's a good thing when the syndicates or the newspapers give voices to different people to tell stories. That's with me, I'm always thinking about, with my comic strip, I can do things for the first time that other people just aren't even thinking about. One of Baldo's friend is an Asian American guy who works with him at the Auto Erod parts shop. I did a character that's actually a robot. She's one of those tele robots that go to school with monitors and stuff. And she's Raina. And no one had ever done that before, of having like an actual robot in your comic strip. That's like not a sci-fi, but kind of like something that's really happening today. So I try to do all kinds of different stuff as often as I can, just to bring these different voices. And so every time I see that happening, sure, it's a thing to celebrate, of course.
Well, speaking of, you said a little bit earlier about how you started this in '98 with Carlos, and of course premiered in 2000. I want to real quickly touch on, since we talked about Steenz kind of developing her version of Heart, what went into the creation of Baldo and the Family?
We approached it as basically just a family strip. Back then when we launched, you would see cats, you saw dogs, you saw all kinds of other types of characters, but you really didn't see Latinos. So the character, like for Baldo, the basic idea was just a 15-year-old kid who likes cars. He's a typical average high schooler, who wants to be cool but isn't quite cool enough in his eyes. For he can be cooler if he tried harder. Carlos came up with those. If you go back to the sketches, just those first sketch of Baldo back, in January of '98. There was another sketch in between there, but by April of that year, Baldo was kind of taking shape, and it was just one of those things where you see it and it's going to work. We like the character, we like the way he looked, and of course that April '98 character just kind of has evolved into what Baldo looks like today.
And then the reason I was bringing up the other pictures is because you have the whole family, of course. Tia Carmen is one of the, most popular, the ones that everybody always talks about. Right. But then you sent me this picture that I want to ask you about Baldo's sister. What was the thought process there?
Yeah, Gracie, and my original notes was Baldo's older sister, like an 18-year-old, maybe a senior in high school, who would always give Baldo a hard time. And Carlos called me up one day, and while we were developing these characters, and he said, "Dude," he goes, "it might be more fun if we just took 10 years off of Gracie and made her an 8-year-old instead of an 18-year-old. And I was like, That worked. Sure. Let's go with that. You drew such an adorable little girl that I can't say no. And so it kind of worked out. Gracie is probably one of our more popular characters as well. Gracie and Carmen always get a lot of, comments and mail regarding those two characters. And I love Gracie. Gracie's kind of reminds me basically of all of the strong women I grew up with in South Texas. And she represents that. She's just a smart little girl.
Speaking of drawing from experience, one of the questions in the stream is from Tony Green asking Steenz, are you going to incorporate librarians into your strip? That seems kind of important.
Yeah, I mean, once a librarian, always a librarian, so it'll definitely come through. I think one of the first things I want to do is make sure that I'm giving enough time to developing the characters with my voice first. So, I've got like 6 to 9 months already written, but I'm going to be here for a while, so you'll see all kinds of stuff.
We also got a question from Phil Mackey, who does the Stay Tuned podcast and video show. He asked, how do you stay relevant in physical papers as physical papers have become less prominent over the years? And actually, as I'm seeing this, I'm also thinking about, I put up the strip earlier, Hector, where you showed social distancing in Baldo.
Right.
And you very famously, a couple years ago, brought in the concept of undocumented families. So let's ask, how do you stay relevant? Do you have to be controversial to stay relevant, or are there other means? What do you think?
There's nothing wrong with controversy. You want people to talk about your strip, but I think it's still got to be an organic, sincere way of doing it. The way I look at it is I want to focus on stories that nobody else is going to do. Luann, Zitz, they're not going to come out with like one of their friends as a dreamer, so only Baldo can kind of do that. So I focus on that. This was maybe a year and a half ago. You see there where Cruz comes out and actually tells Baldo that he came to the United States when he was
5 years old. Yeah. And that was just a very, very powerful story. I know that got a lot of comments from a lot of creator friends that I know. And Hector, you still with us?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's technical difficulties. Hector will come back in a second, I'm sure. But I got
think
another.
It's really interesting, him talking about those kinds of serious stories, because, I definitely have a few planned myself. And I think when it comes to staying relevant, you have to think about less so what's happening with current events and more so what are things that are eternal, because there's always going to be, stories about people who are different from you, or there's always going to be something that has to do with, activism, and there's always going to be something that has to do with gender and sexuality. And I feel like if you're really thinking about it, it feels eternal because you're talking about things that are eternal, but I know that with Heart of the City, I've definitely been asked, are you going to include like coronavirus? How much stuff are you actually going to put in for real life? And on the one hand, Mark already did a coronavirus bit, so I'm not going to do another. But also, I feel like there are some things that, need to be talked about. And then there are some things that not entirely, and I can see one of the questions is, given that we work months in advance, I'm already worried about having to revise something based on current events. Yeah, I am, because I don't like revising. But hey, welcome back, Hector.
I'm back.
Well, that Mikkel Snyder's question actually is a good point. Hector, you incorporated the Dreamers, which is still an issue, but you also very briefly touched on social distancing.
Right.
Is this something where you maybe work weeks in advance, but if something comes up, you can sneak in a strip that's more current, or is it that you are just working 1 week at a time?
Well, there is the problem that if you're writing something like a very current events, that by the time the strip comes out, it's old news. Mm-hmm. But something told me that this COVID thing was going to be around for a long time. It's like this ain't going anywhere.
You have to pick your battles about what things you want to talk about and which ones that you're like, I don't know, it might be dead and done by then,
Right. Well, even the Dreamer storyline, I mean, that was changing almost every week for a while. So I hesitated to do a Dreamer storyline. So you have to find that sweet spot where it's going to stay relevant, stay timely, and won't be outdated by the time it comes out. With the COVID, the social distancing stuff, we threw the dice and said, okay, well, we're going to assume it's still going to be around in 3 or 4 weeks when these strips come out in the paper.
So how far back was that particular strip done?
Oh, probably 3 weeks ago. And
Okay.
we have one more coming out at the end of May, and I'm like, it's a Sunday. It's like, boy, we're going to be cutting that really close.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully, it's even if it's a moot point by then, it'll still be a fun strip.
Hey, I want to ask you guys something kind of tied to Phil's question earlier as well, which is newspapers. When I started reporting 20 years ago, I remember telling my friends and family, oh, it's great being a journalist because it doesn't matter what city I go to in the country, everybody needs a reporter. There's always, newspapers. That's become less true. And Steenz, you said that you talked about doing a webcomic before doing a physical comic, and both of your comics are available on gocomics.com.
Yeah.
What do you guys think is the future of daily comics like this? Are we kind of switching to or merging with web comics? Are newspaper comics still viable? Again, that was the first thing I would read whenever I'd pick up a newspaper. So there's that. I know I wasn't alone in that.
No, I think they're still very viable. I mean, I think they're still the most powerful way to do a comic these days. Is in the daily newspaper. I think even comic book stores have been having hard times as well. But I think the newspaper comic strip remains one of the most powerful ways to do comics these days, other than maybe comic books. But people do ask me, for advice, and like Steenz said, just do your own stuff on the web and do what you love and work on a web strip and see where it goes and build a fan base and go from there. But newspaper comics, I think, are still pretty influential and still read by millions of people.
And I think we also have to remember that newspaper comics are changing with the times as well. Right. Phoebe and Her Unicorn is one of the most popular graphic novels out there, and that's a strip. Same thing with Big Nate. So it's yes, they are still going to be in newspapers, but with Go Comics and with the rise of comics on sites like Tapas and Webtoons, and even comics that are just hosted on Instagram, people are definitely still looking for and reading sequential stories. So I think it's really all about finding ways to grow with the times. And I'm personally happy that they're still collecting a lot of these comic strips,
Well, let me ask a related question to that, and that is, how does somebody break into the business? You mentioned earlier building a fan base with a webcomic. I think that's a great idea. How does one get into syndicated publishing? I know I mentioned Phil Mackey earlier. He did a comic strip when he was in college, and that was a difficult transition, that idea. So,
well, it's always been difficult to get into syndication. I mean, there are just a few hundred people who work, have a comic syndicated. It's not a whole lot of people. It's a very small group. As far as breaking in, you just got to try your best. Just draw a comic, send it in, see what happens, and then do it again and do it again and do it again. Sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. I mean, it's just like anything else, I think, or a lot of these type of professions where you just have to keep trying at it and hopefully something good happens. The key to anything is just being good at it. I think you just have to be pretty good at it. Just be better than other people and have a unique story and a unique message. And if you're not syndicated, like I said earlier, put it on the web, launch your own site, and be a PvP and show people that you can create, a giant fan base on your own.
And when it comes to, keep trying, that is for real. I know I was talking to Barbara Brandon Croft about where I'm coming from, and she had her comic, rejected tons of time before she finally got in, you know? And so it is really about that perseverance. But, you know, also sometimes it's less what can I do and how can I help the entire community of strip comics or any comics really. This kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions, but I know that in order for people to get any kind of jobs, you kind of have to know the right people. And if the people that are making these decisions and the people who are deciding what comics go where, if they're only pulling from their pool of people, then there's not really much that you can do, you know? So it's really about making sure that I think it's kind of on us as people who are already in the industry to be visible and to show others that, you know, you can also do it just like I can. And we have to really start widening our Rolodexes, you know, as people with power to get more people in.
Right.
You know, we got a couple other questions here that were pretty relevant as well. David James asked about helping dialogue reflect the characters. And then Jonathan Norfleet asked about balancing writing with daily life. And I feel like those two things kind of tie together. You have to bring a voice to the characters, but you also need to be able to do this on a regular basis while having other things go on. This is something you talked about a lot earlier, Hector. Is it difficult maintaining that pace of every single day having a comic? Wait, actually, let me ask you a quick question. Do you take breaks? Are there like vacation periods where you just run reruns, or is it every single day for 20 years?
The syndicate does give you, you know, a week or two to run reprints in the newspaper. When you plan them ahead, usually it could be like Christmas week. I'm not going to spend, you know, I'm not going to turn in a week of strips on, you know, Wednesday, Christmas Day, you know, Christmas week. You know, we're going to send in reprints. So you do get 1 or 2 weeks a year. But other than that, it's part of your life, man. It's nonstop. I was at a cartoonist meeting a few years ago, and I was talking to this other cartoonist, and this cartoonist said, Hector, I've been doing this for like 30 years, you know, and it's just been such a part of my life that I'm starting to think, you know, is this all there is? You know, there's more to just drawing a cartoon comic strip every day. And I was like, man, I'm almost, you know, I'm right behind you. But, you know, we're lucky to be doing comics. You know, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to do comics. You know, I thought about writing stories for Marvel and DC, and I would draw as a kid a lot. I mean, it's a dream come true. So yeah, I'm going to do it, and it's part of my life. It weaves in and out of my hours almost every day. I mean, it's just part of who I am.
Yeah, and I think you also have to like get pretty good at scheduling as well, you know, to make sure you don't miss those big life events. You know, I don't do mine one a day. I do 2 a day so that the back half of my week is free for other things. And it makes it a little bit easier to maintain, but I definitely think it's definitely gonna be just a part of my life. You know, I woke up this morning and I was excited. I was like, oh, cool, I get to draw some comics today. You know, like it's always gonna be nice. Everyone has like their bad days, but we can't really be too angry because, I mean, we're making comics for a living, you know?
Hey, I want to real quickly shift gears. You were talking about cartooning earlier. Steenz, you teach cartooning. But speaking of cartoons, there's something that I saw Hector show at a Brownsville show a while back, and I just wanted to share it as well. There was almost going to be a Baldo cartoon.
Right.
And I just was really excited about it, and what I saw was really high quality. I want to play a clip in a minute because this looks really, really cool. It's a few short clips, but could you tell us what this was and how this process came about?
Yeah, sure, of course. It was more dream come true stuff. I mean, a few years after Baldo came out, or not long after Baldo came out, we started getting phone calls from studios in Los Angeles asking us if they could talk to us about turning Baldo into a TV show. So Carlos and I flew out. We met with 3 or 4 different studios and made a deal to have Baldo turn into a cartoon. And we worked on it for a couple of years. We got a pilot. We got a few more episodes produced, and then it's what can happen in Hollywood. It just hits a roadblock. It hits a barrier where it just doesn't make that final hump over. But yes, the animation was beautiful. We worked with really top talented people out there. It was well financed. It was well done. It would have been on one of the big networks, but that final hump just wasn't. We're unable to overcome that final hump. But yeah, the show itself is beautiful. If you're going to show a clip, I mean, you can see how high it's really funny, because I used to read Crazy magazine when I was young, and I remember a lot of the artists and a lot of the people who drew Crazy, and I went to the animation studio where they were drawing Baldo, and I called to get directions out there, and I remember calling on my phone and dialing the number that somebody had given me, and they answered the phone, Baldo, and I'm like, how did they know? How did they know it was me? And then I said, oh, okay, that's because that's the name of the production studio. So I went out there and met the animators, and it was such a treat to meet these guys, these really talented animators. And one of them was actually Bob Foster, who used to draw a lot of the stories in Crazy, I believe, Crazy magazine. And I was like,
Crazy was part of Marvel, actually. So that's
right. And I was like, Bob, I used to read your stuff when I was like a kid. And here he was working on my my animated show. So that was a magical time. Maybe, who knows, maybe someday something will happen more with that. But it was a great experience.
All right, well, let's play a few short clips.
Sure.
Baldo.
Good morning, Chacho.
I love those bits. So yeah, you had a whole pilot produced, really, really high quality animation. I just think it's a shame that we couldn't put it out there more, but I just love how much that we can show right now.
Well, they call it La La Land for a reason. I mean, it's kind of crazy out there, man.
I can only imagine. Well, I know you guys both have upcoming projects, but they're both not quite ready to be announced yet, and that's totally okay. However, I know that people are really, really excited to hear what you guys have coming up down the pipeline. One of the questions that was asked right now from Snyder again was, is there anything that you would recommend people read if they want to check out other newspaper comic strips? Obviously, I think Baldo and Heart of the City would be good recommendations, but beyond those.
I love Nancy. I think Nancy is fantastic. It's just like, it takes another type of thinking to be able to do not just visual humor, but humor about visual humor, and I think that's one of the best things about Nancy. So yeah, Olivia James Nancy would be one that I would pick.
And that's a comic that's evolved a lot actually recently, so that's pretty cool.
Right.
And Hector, any suggestions for you?
I read most everything on the comics page, all the comics. I've been reading a lot more chapter books recently, just because I'd love to explore chapter books with some of the characters in Baldo, like Gracie. So I've been, reading tons of those chapter books. People think I'm nuts. I probably have. Oh, look! I have one right here.
Yay!
Hey, that's big name. Steenz mentioned earlier.
Pretty big. And Steenz was mentioning.
Yeah.
Here it is. So it's just a matter of just reading what's out there today, what's what young people are reading, and I pretty much devour whatever's out there that's related to comics.
Great minds think alike. I always love it when somebody mentions something and somebody else is like, I happen to have that right here.
It happens to be there.
All right. Well, thank you guys both for joining me. I think we're gonna sign off in a minute, but it's just been a real pleasure, and I'm glad people got a chance to hear more from you, and hopefully people will check out more of your stuff. Any final words you'd like to give and share with the public, Steenz?
Stay safe. Play Animal Crossing, and keep on keeping on.
Good advice, Hector.
Yeah, that's Animal Crossing is on our TV all the time around here. So, yeah, I would say same thing. Read, get smart, read the news, read your newspaper. That's got support your local newspaper. I would have to tell that to everybody.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. And with that, I guess I'm going to just repeat that. Stay safe, keep reading, keep making myths. Thank you guys. Goodbye.